You're listening to The Stark Truth with Robert Stark. Visit us on the web at www.starktruthradio.com.
This is Robert Stark. I am joined here with both Greg Johnson and Rabbit. We're going to be discussing the topics of the left wing of the alt-right and Swipple nationalism. It's great having Greg Johnson and Rabbit back on the show.
Thanks, guys, for having me on.
Yeah, it's been a long time, guys.
And I'm also joined here with my co-host, Pillator.
Hi, Greg. Hi, Rabbit.
Hey.
Rabbit, you started this alt-left project on your website, altleft.com, and you have a manifesto out there about the alt-left. And I know Greg Johnson has interviewed... Well, Greg Johnson was with you on a podcast with Millennial Woes about the alt-left. And Greg Johnson wrote this essay called West Coast White Nationalism, which was, I think Greg wrote this several years ago, it was a long time ago. Rabbit, would you say that it influenced you, that essay influenced you, and was it a precursor to the alt-left?
No, because I didn't read it before that, but it does, I mean, he's thinking along the same lines as I was, definitely. So I think I was pointed to it after I created the site, but it was pretty much in line with my ideas in terms of what I was thinking.
And Greg, can you talk about that essay you wrote and some of the issues you go over? You talk about people who are identitarian, but they have views, they're critical of corporate chain stores. They're into things like historic preservation, environmentalism, a lot of Swipple type of things.
I think the West Coast white nationalist idea was put really well by Dark Enlightenment on the most recent podcast of the Northwest Imperative series at TRS. He said that he has moved from the far left to the far right, but at no time in that process did he ever like Monsanto. And I thought that was really clever. There are a lot of people like that. I think that a lot of what counts as left in America is just healthy European folkways, such as rejecting adulterated foods, artificial foods, to rejecting bad forms of agriculture, ugly forms of city planning, dehumanizing architecture, things like that. A lot of these are just resurgences of European folkways, but they've been bundled up together with anti-capitalism, and anti-capitalism has been bundled in with Marxism and the whole left. And one of the ways that I put this strange package deal is a lot of the hippie culture in the 60s was basically sort of a fusion of Tolkien and Marcuse. And the Tolkien stuff is really our stuff. It's good. And the Marcuse stuff we can discard for the most part. And I think that a lot of people who have those values that are sort of hippie-ish and in later iterations Swipple-ish or hipster-ish are really keyed into things that feel authentic to them as people of European descent. And we just need to wean them off of the cultural Marxist agenda that's been bundled in with these ideas. And I think more and more people are coming around as they recognize that it's not a package deal and that there are bad things about Marxism, egalitarianism, multiculturalism, and there are good things about being a little crunchier, a little more oriented towards ecology, towards walkable communities, towards zoning, being critical of free markets and things like that.
I think it's crucial to reach out to both the left and the right and expand the Overton window. I think the left can be a little more anti-immigration, less PC, but I also think the right needs to become more economically populist. And I even see that trend with, even on sites like Breitbart, and I saw a pullout that said Trump supporters, not necessarily Trump's policies, but his original primary voters, were both the most anti-immigration, but also most in favor of a social safety net.
That makes perfectly good sense to me, frankly. I think that a nationalist populist position is actually a far more coherent and defensible political philosophy than either the Democratic left or the Republican right, which are sort of weird coalitions of warring interest groups that don't really have a coherent outlook behind them. And so Trumpian nationalist populism, I think, represents what people really want in politics in America. And I think that more and more people are going to realize that this is what they really want. Even people who were opposed to Trump, who even voted for Hillary Clinton, union people, for instance, people like that. A lot of those people came around. More will come around, I think, as we start seeing positive effects of populist nationalism.
There's this concept I coined called the alt-left dilemma, and Rabbit's talked a lot about it as well. You sort of have like your ideal place to live in an aesthetic and cultural sense, and you've lived in San Francisco. That's the kind of place, if obviously it's very expensive, but purely as far as architecture and natural setting goes, I see that as kind of the ideal place aesthetically. That's also a place where a lot of people, a lot of the parasitic elites and political adversaries are. And the same is true places like plenty of other places in America, like Santa Monica and even New York City, places that have great architecture and a lot of really people who have these great aesthetics taste. And a lot of people I talk to who share my similar cultural interest might have different political views, but yet at the same time, there's this kind of like white middle class identitarianism, and the white middle class identitarianism, that was a major factor behind support for Trump. But a lot of those people lack those grand aesthetic visions. They tend to fetishize the kind of suburban sprawl model and living in like a track house in the suburbs and like defending Walmart. Greg first and then Rabbit, can you comment on that whole topic of the alt-left dilemma?
Well, it is true that a lot of people who are conservative are just Philistines. There's no question about that. I think part of the reason for that is they have been badly educated. Let's face it, we get terrible education in America anymore. And things like aesthetics, art, history, those sorts of things have been given the short shrift for a very long time. So that doesn't really surprise me. I think if we had more art and music appreciation courses, better exposure to these sorts of things outside the sort of liberal enclaves, that there would be a change in that particular problem.
Greg, do you want to comment on your experiences living in San Francisco and the appeal to a place like that, as far as architecture and cities and wilderness go? I know with Berkeley, the big thing in the news is all the rioting and a lot of the radical leftist culture. I was in Berkeley recently and I met up with a Bay Area guy, Anatoly Karlin, and it does have some of the appeal of a European city. It's a small, compact, urban, walkable community. There's some really great wilderness areas nearby, and those are great qualities, despite a lot of the nasty stuff people associate with Berkeley.
Oh yeah, well I lived in Berkeley for more than 3 years, and I loved it there. But I kept saying to myself that the town, all it really needs is a neutron bomb to clean out some of the horrible horrible people who lived there, but the town itself was beautiful, had lots of really nice architecture and amenities. The weather was fantastic, for one thing. I really enjoyed that. So it was one of my favorite places that I've lived in terms of the aesthetics, the location, the amenities, and so forth. And one of my least favorite places in terms of the kinds of people who lived there and the kinds of politics that reigned everywhere. One thing about suburbia, just to go back to what you were mentioning earlier, I think a lot of white middle-class people with families end up in suburbia and defend suburbia because they've basically been ethnically cleansed out of cities. Yeah, and I think that that's an unfortunate thing that's happened to them because it is somewhat impoverishing to them culturally. However, the fact is that they probably made the better choice of the choices they were offered, which is to leave cities in order to find safe places to have families and raise families, because most people do not feel, especially unless you're really wealthy, most white people do not feel safe having children in a lot of our major metropolitan areas anymore. You can't segregate yourself by any other means than money. And without segregation from non-whites, many white people don't feel safe having kids. And only the rich really can do that in major cities like San Francisco or New York anymore. And so I think that is one of the driving forces of suburbanization. If we were to change the ethnic balance of our cities, I think you would find that there were and make a family formation more affordable, to use one of Steve Saylor's terms. I think that if I were to craft policies for the future, I would have an all-white society, and I would make sure that family formation is very affordable in large cities so that children can have the best amenities culturally and so forth, the best education, the best museums, the best zoos, the best parks. And yeah, if you are in a part of the country like San Francisco or Berkeley or Seattle, you can have really great urban areas that are quite close to great natural parks and things like that. That urban life in America for middle-class people was really kind of a paradise between, say, the teens and the 1960s, or early 70s, after which desegregation basically just destroyed some of the great large cities in America, at least for middle-class people.
Yeah, that's been a big issue with the busing destroyed the middle class in urban areas, and that was a major factor contributing to urban sprawl. And the left supports busing, and the conservatives, either they don't want to touch on that issue because it's too politically incorrect. I also think conservatives have this love affair with suburbia. That's a factor too. You were talking about your experience in Berkeley and some of my observations about the different areas, including the suburban areas. One thing I noticed is that I spent some time in the East Bay, and there's a city called Dublin, which is heavily immigrant, but you see a lot of these, you're really kind of stereotypical, like Southern California, track housing developments. Then there's another town near Berkeley, which is called Lafayette, it's majority white, but it's like a small town in a rural setting, and it has BART access. But what brought my attention to that is there was this housing advocate through the Bay Area Renters, I think it's called BARF, Bay Area Renters Federation. He talks a lot about the housing crisis in the Bay Area, but in an interview, I heard her say something how the town of Lafayette in particular, which is near Berkeley, they didn't want more housing developments because it would bring more diversity to their community.
It doesn't surprise me. It does not surprise me. And it would also not surprise me if the people of Lafayette are huge, flaming liberals. They just don't want diversity in their backyards. You get a lot of that. definitely get a lot of that in California.
And that is one of the factors that makes the Bay Area one of the most livable. If you're a multimillionaire, of course, I mean, there's not really much of a middle class, is the sort of environmental preservation and historic preservation, but it's not viable for the middle class. How do you reconcile those issues? Because a lot of sprawl apologists, they'll say that in order, like a good example of that is someone like Joel Kotkin, if you're familiar with him. He's saying that we have to get rid of historic preservation and develop open space if we want to sustain a strong middle class.
I'm not familiar. What's his argument for that exactly?
His argument is that suburban sprawl is necessary to sustain a strong middle class. But if we go back in history, I mean, look, New York, San Francisco in the 1950s, and even cities in Europe today, and you could look to even Asian cities as examples, there's cities that are vibrant urban environments, but that have healthy, strong middle classes.
Yeah, but I don't see how historic preservation is a problem. What's the reason that he thinks historic preservation is a problem?
Well, he's primarily saying that the people who want to put limitations on urban sprawl.
Okay. Well, I am all for historic preservation, even if it does cause a little bit of urban sprawl, because the last thing I want is to see, say, Rockefeller Center torn down so they can build up, some big apartment blocks that will, increase the density of population in Manhattan some more. I think that's not a good trade, honestly. Of course, there's plenty of really hideous architecture that you could tear down, but putting up giant boxes, filing cabinets full of people, still doesn't strike me as a net improvement. One thing I honestly think we need to do is we simply need to reduce the population of the country. The United States is overcrowded. Of course, if you want to make the entire continent into a suburb, we could get billions of people here. But there really are quite enough people in the United States. The population in the United States circa 1970 was enough to send a man to the moon. It was enough to support all of our great cultural and technological achievements. And we don't need 320 million people on this continent. And if we could start sending away some of the people who are here illegally, and I think that number is certainly more than 20 million, probably more than 30 million, I think we would see significant decreases in housing costs, congestion, and things like that. So I'd like to reduce our population to take some pressure off green spaces, to stop urban sprawl, to stop pollution, stop congestion. And I think we can do that. And I think that if Trump gets his way, if he deports everybody who's here illegally, he's going to end up deporting more than 20 million people, probably more than 30 million people.
You mentioned that overpopulation is a problem, but you also said affordable family formation is also a crucial issue. So you're saying the ideal would be to have an immigration moratorium, but to create a situation where your average person can maybe have 2 kids, and then you would have healthy middle-class families, but also a fairly stable population at the same time. Is that what you see as the ideal?
That's what I'd like. I'd like to see a stable population or a slowly growing population. And
you don't see the situation where a lot of countries like Germany, they have maybe 1 kid on average, and that brings about problems even without immigration, problems of aging, and Japan has the same problem.
Yeah. I think that those countries are a bit crowded. They could maybe do with a smaller native population, but it is creating problems to have really catastrophically below replacement birth rates. And a lot of European societies have really low birth rates. 2 is below replacement. So when you're getting to countries with a 1.7 birth rate or something like that, that is catastrophically low, and it's going to lead to long-term problems. So Yeah, I'd like to have a stable population in the United States of about 200 million people.
Yeah, I mean, first, I want to say that I agree. I think that I always really hate the argument that people make that Japan and these countries have low birth rates and that's why they need immigration or something like. I mean, Japan is the size of California, but it has triple the population. So it's like, they're way overpopulated. Like they need to come down by one or 2/3 at least. So, and I think that it becomes an issue of space and resources. And so people have this idea that it's like, oh, if you're below replacement level, then you're going to go down to zero. Like it's not going to happen like that. Like at a certain point, as more space starts to open up and more resources become available to like the smaller amount of people that are left, they're going to have more room to work with and repopulate. If you're like sitting in Tokyo, like living in like a sardine can, like obviously you're not going to have multiple kids, but once the population goes down to a certain level, then the apartments there's going to be more room to have larger apartments. There's going to be more resources. So you can begin to, that number it's going to bottom out at some point. And at least Japan is doing it the right way in that, they're doing the opposite of what Europe is doing. Like if your birth rate is going down, that's manageable as long as you're not bringing in millions and millions of people at the same time that are like hostile aliens, which is that Europe is their birth rates are going down and they're bringing these people in that have high birth rates from a hostile alien culture. So it's just the worst of both worlds. And it's forcing people, I think on quote, our side to say like, well, gee, like, we have limited money and resources and wages are down, but now we've got to pump out kids just to keep up with these immigrants that are coming in. Like white people need to have more kids. So it's just a terrible situation in my view. As far as the alt-left dilemma, like what you mentioned, I think, what it comes down to me is a question of nationalism, really, and in different cultures. There's this kind of assumption in large parts of the right or even the alt-right that when you come into like pro-white movements or white identity, that like they automatically assume that you're on board with all of this other cultural stuff. A lot of them are basically very like a neo-Confederate cultural, or almost like if you had like a GOP plus, like so many of these people are like, they're basically like Ted Cruz Republicans, but plus the issue of like race realism and like fasciness. But the way I see it is just as in Europe when you had these different nationalist movements, like a nationalist movement in the southern United States is not going to have the same identical culture and societal norms, even religion, things like that, as you would see in Oregon or Washington. And you even see that even within the alt-right and these movements, you do see these, Cascadia often clashing with these, people in the South that might be more traditional, more religious, and then you have California. So I think you do see that. To me, it comes down of a question of like, just because I'm pro-white, like, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't presume that I'm on board with with the entire cultural or aesthetic preference that somebody in Arkansas might have.
And another thing that's interesting about aesthetics is in Greg's essay, West Coast White Nationalism and Rabbit's alt-left, I think there is some difference. Greg Johnson talks more about this kind of Tolkien vision of people living in these small scale communities, like traditional European villages, and then I think that's great. But I also like a lot of more modern stuff from the 20th century as well. And Rabbit is really into the kind of mid-century space age aesthetic, and into things like futurism and the 60s sci-fi writers like Heinlein. So like what Greg was saying, like basically leftism, but taking the Marcuse out of the Tolkien. Like Rabbit's alt left would be maybe Tolkien, but adding like Heinlein.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think that's where some of a lot of the implicit whiteness comes in, because when I look at mid-century modern is pretty big, at least in Phoenix where I am, and there is tons of groups and historical preservation for that. And when I would get involved in some of these groups on these forums and stuff, like, I mean, it's unbelievable, like how implicitly like white these these home tours are and things like that. And it's just like, but it's also
except maybe you might have like a white male, Asian female couple. That's just what it is.
Oh God. No. But you have these things, and I really love that era in particular for the space age, promise, and really just kind of like, growing up, like the future that we were kind of expecting to be able to live in, which, at a certain point was just abandoned for like this, third world fetishism and like food stamps. And, we don't need to build a colony on the moon like in 2001, like, because Jemima needs her food stamps and education for her 8 kids, and things like that.
I want to also say too that because we're talking about those alt-left utopianisms, it's unfortunate because on the 1980s, William Gibson's science fiction book Neuromancer, though Neuromancer created the whole cyberpunk genre, even though it was labeled as a dystopian future, like a future that's not welcomed, like something that's terrible to live in, everyone kind of fetishized after that society, and there was this whole obsession with the cyberpunk narrative. And sooner or later in the 90s and kind of now, there's this now love for this weird cyberpunk world, which is kind of the multicultural mess, right? And William Gibson's book that came 10 years later, Idaru, that is about when Japan rules everybody. And if there's some like gleeful cuck-like whites who are like, oh, wouldn't it be amazing if China and Japan ruled over us and everybody was a living anime character, where it seems kind of almost disgusting because it's this it seems like that's where, I don't know, it's like when people watch Blade Runner and say that's the future, when everything is so disgusting in the Blade Runner scenic view, like, and when we're talking about, Heinlein and Tolkien or something like that, at least those societies seem a little more healthy compared to, like, I can't understand the person who lives in a major city and then says, it's not disgusting that there's this ghetto of, it's multiculturalism and it's so nice and everything's just so disgusting outside,
I do want to ask Greg this, because Greg lived in San Francisco and we were talking about architecture. He mentioned the Rockefeller Center, and I talked about this with Giorgiani. What's interesting is, ironically, the Rockefellers are kind of synonymous with liberal internationalism. But on purely an aesthetic level, that's a magnificent building, and I'm a big fan of a lot of the like early 20th century Art Deco futurism, like the Chrysler Building, Empire State Building, and you have some of that in San Francisco. I'm also a big fan of this sort of late brutalism, 70s futurism, like the Transamerica Pyramid in San Francisco and the Embarcadero Center in San Francisco, which was designed by John Portman. Greg, are you a fan of that kind of stuff, or do you see it as too modern?
Oh, I don't mind the Transamerica building. It's certainly more interesting than a box made out of the same materials and about the same size. The greatest architectural era in America so far, I really believe, was Art Deco. Yeah. Oh, I'd love it if Trump made America Art Deco again. Unfortunately, he's got something of a bad record on Art Deco. He actually tore down some Art Deco structures in New York. But Art Deco is a wonderfully heroic vision of the future. It's aesthetically very pleasing. And I find that the later international style is generally kind of bland, although there are some buildings in that style that are aesthetically pleasing because they depart from the glass box model. So I do think Art Deco is wonderful. And one of the things I liked about living in New York was going to see certain Art Deco buildings and their decorations, their settings. It's wonderful. And Rockefeller Center is a superb piece of architecture. And there's some great Art Deco in Los Angeles. There's some great Art Deco in San Francisco. And, of course, the best piece of Art Deco in San Francisco is the Golden Gate Bridge. So that's an Art Deco masterpiece.
There's also a lot of them around Union Square and Nob Hill.
Yeah.
And Coit Tower is Art Deco.
Yes, and I really like Coit Tower. I also think, though, that the greatest American architect was Frank Lloyd Wright. I love his work. And there's some very...
The gallery he designed near Union Square, and I think he also did the Marin County Civic Center.
Yeah, the Xanadu Gallery. I think it's closed now. I think it went out of business. But I used to take people there all the time because I like to show them the sort of sketch for the Guggenheim, because it's sort of a mini Guggenheim with the ramp idea. And it's a beautiful gem of architecture, and I hope it reopens sometime with something interesting in it. And then, yeah, the Marin Civic Center is pretty magnificent. But that period, which sort of ended, I guess, in the post-war era, was really a great period in American architecture and urban design.
There's this kind of perception that modern art and architecture is leftist and quote-unquote degenerate, but there's this whole tradition of modern art of the so-called right. And there's these great examples. There's Italian Futurism. There's, Italian Futurism had an impact on Art Deco. There's the artist and writer Wyndham Lewis. There's Jonathan Bowden. There's Salvador Dali. There's writers like Ferdinand Celine.
Oh yeah, right-wing modernism was a huge thing up to the end of the Second World War, basically. And I think it's a perfectly coherent vision. Now, it is true that a lot of the Bauhaus types were basically communists, and they tried to fit their Marxist theories into this to some extent. But in truth, one of the driving forces, and this does sound a bit Marxist, I suppose, one of the driving forces behind modern architecture was simply the fact that one could do new things with new materials that one couldn't do before. Now, I don't think that the base determines the superstructure, but it's certainly there as a condition of possibility. And what people did with it at that point is sort of underdetermined, and it's really belongs to the realm of human freedom and human imagination. And the period between the wars, especially with Italian Art Deco and Futurism, I think it's a great period in art history. And there was a fantastic exhibition on Italian Futurism back in 2014 in New York City at the Guggenheim. It was probably the biggest art futurist exhibition ever curated, and it was pretty remarkable. And it's very clear that between Futurism and Art Deco, there's very little difference when it comes to architecture and design. And what they were trying to do is they were trying to capture vitality and optimism and the new possibilities that were created by technology. And I think that that's entirely healthy. And so you can make a distinction between vital modern art and decadent or degenerate modern art. And there's a lot of degenerate modern art. It's essentially a celebration of ugliness and weakness. The Lucian Freud painting of the hideously fat woman. It's lots and lots of ugly stuff, usually created by communists, interestingly enough. That is degenerate. But it is not the whole of modern art. And when you look at Italian Futurism or you look at Art Deco, these are vital. They're vital forms of artistic expression. And I think that they're perfectly consistent with the mood of a society that is forward-looking and surging upwards, celebrating its own power, celebrating its heritage, searching out new ways of doing things. And that's really a modernist spirit, but it can be rooted in an understanding of our heritage, rooted in European tradition. And so, for instance, one of the things that I like about Art Deco is that it is not a complete break with European tradition. It is not something like is celebrated by Ayn Rand in the beginning of The Fountainhead, which is casting aside tradition entirely. It's an attempt to basically fuse new building techniques with certain classic architectural motifs that mean something to us and that have been proven over time to be pleasing to the eye.
Rabbit, you're a big fan of Italian Futurism.
Yeah, I am actually, and that's kind of interesting because, I'm really into that whole period of Italian Futurism, and and when I got into a lot of these pro-white movements and whatnot, I was kind of like, everyone wants to really get away from like the image of fascism and all this stuff. And it's like it's a bad brand. Like we need to get away from that and all this stuff. But all of that, like a lot of those aesthetics, like, and I don't mean like the costume Nazi type stuff, but a lot of those like the early like fascist manifestos and ideas and art and things like that, like were things that I still find to be very appealing. I mean, especially like not just the Italian futurists and fascists, but also the British aesthetics and some of these other ones. But so I noticed that when I got into these movements, that like it's filled with people that they absolutely hate any kind of modern art. You always see these memes that are they're always like very like, I find them to be very like annoying and triggering.
Oh, yeah.
Someone will show like a side by side photo of like here's a 15th century church, and then here's this on the right, this ugly like brutalist one, and I'm always like, well, gee, I kind of like the one on the right better, like, just so you guys know, like, but that's just me personally. And also like, I actually, I like a lot of the, minimalist stuff and, abstract expression stuff from the 60s.
Like a Mondrian.
Yeah, well, that, and also, I mean, all of the more minimalist stuff from even stuff like, as vapid as like Ellsworth Kelly. Like I even like that stuff aesthetically, but I would kind of draw the line where, and I think that too, that you see a lot of people don't really distinguish between like modern and like and contemporary or postmodern. Even it's like I don't put that stuff which was expressionist, but at least had like a color usage and was meant to be aesthetically pleasing, which stuff like Piss Christ, like a jar of urine or something, or or even like that's performance art like that, Milo's jokey like performance of blood in a bathtub, he's taking a bath. You just see so much of that kind of garbage, or even like a giant sword or something made out of Legos or something like that. I distinguish between what was like a sort of the modernist movement of that existed within a particular period of time, and what is just like called modern art now, which is it's come to mean just like anything that somebody thinks is ugly or gross.
Rabbit, on your alt-left manifesto, you have this excellent video by this cute Asian girl, and she explains the difference between modernism and postmodernism. And I guess the way I look at things is modernism, my interpretation is modernism is about progress and furthering civilization, and postmodernism is a society kind of in decay, and people are confused and looking for answers.
Well, there's that element to it, but I think that it, like early on, you have to remember that art had a different function across society, but they didn't have cameras, so with the invention of the camera, where you could suddenly duplicate something perfectly, then people became interested in like what else could they do with art, if you didn't if somebody didn't need you to paint a portrait of them or something like that. So I think that was definitely a component to it. It wasn't the whole thing, but I think people kind of take that for granted now that for a long time they didn't have cameras or anything, so that's why the art was focused on so representational. That was definitely a part of it.
There is this online meme called Fashwave, and it kind of borrows off the whole sort of 80s retro futurist aesthetic, like vaporwave, cyberpunk, Tron, and it shows this like image of Tron, then Donald Trump, then like a pink neon swastika, and it's kind of part of the troll culture and meme culture. But I like the whole like 80s retro futurist aesthetic as well.
One thing that I really do love, though, is the Blade Runner aesthetic, I guess. Not the city, but just the aesthetic of a kind of 1940s Art Deco.
Oh, like the
film noir in the future. Yeah.
The film noir kind of feel. I'm a big fan of a lot of those old vintage neon signs from the like 30s to 60s. I haven't been to New York, but in San Francisco, there's a lot of them left around North Beach and Union Square.
Mm-hmm. I also very much was taken by the sort of, well, I guess it's sort of proto-steampunk aesthetic that David Lynch created when he did Dune.
Oh, yeah.
I like this sort of combination of the archaic and the futuristic that we talk about, or that Phi talks about in archaeofuturism. And I do think that there are certain elements of that when you look at the Blade Runner aesthetic or the Dune aesthetic. And those were very pleasing to me, I have to say.
I was just saying, compared to that, I remember watching this documentary. I think it was something about the cyberpunk documentary, and people were, I remember the commentary was just about the city of Blade Runner and how it was this love for multicultural and diversity. And, there's something that gets really convoluted that if you're, talking about the future, you have to be very specific on these things. Otherwise, the liberal regime will say it has something to do with this diseased mentality of being, just out there. And, because if you look at the scene like in Blade Runner where it's like everybody, the masses are on the ground. It seems to be a hodgepodge of all these cultures together, all struggling to survive. And then somebody just says, well, this is a wonderful thing to live in. This is like, once again, was the same response for Neuromancer and some of Gibson's work.
Even Akira.
Well, yeah, sometimes for Akira, but I think if you were to avoid that, Akira has a different aesthetic to it that is interesting. But yeah, there is this very convoluted, multicultural, diverse message that gets thieves through these things if not watch, if you watch out for these things.
Society portrayed in Blade Runner, I mean, it's dystopian. You have all this pollution and massive overpopulation and sort of the product of the end result of massive third world immigration. But if we had this kind of ideal society, I think it would be cool to have one sort of like a Times Square-like district that resembled Blade Runner. Greg, what do you think about that?
Oh God, I don't even want Times Square to resemble Times Square. But I guess what I liked about it was simply a sense of an Art Deco film noir futurism. The future itself is ugly and not particularly appealing. It is dystopian, but aesthetically there was something pleasing about just the production design and the look of the whole thing. And interestingly enough, even though the city is overpopulated in the scenes that you see, there are whole buildings that are empty in it, right? Because so many people have moved off world. So you get to the Bradbury apartment building, right? And it's in decay and it has one resident. And that particular set is such ruin porn for me. It's really spectacular. And one of the things that I love about Budapest is the ruin porn. So much of the city is being restored from, decades and decades of communist, basically deferred maintenance, and some of it is still very much a work in project. But to see these magnificent buildings that have fallen into this picturesque decay is sometimes very, very appealing. And of course, they're doing their best to restore it all, which is kind of touching. So,
since we're on the topic of the arts, one of the issues is conservatives want to defund funding for the arts, the national endowments for the arts. And I kind of get it because a lot of it is tied to all this political correct agenda. But if you look back, like even Ezra Pound advocated subsidizing artists and writers. And there's this blogger named Lion, who goes by Lion of the Blogosphere. I don't know if you've heard of him. He actually proposed a basic income for high IQ people. And I actually think that's an excellent idea because you have all these really intelligent, intellectual people. And you have the people who are unemployed, or you have a lot of the people, the kind of neat phenomenon, people who spend all their time online, or there's people who are kind of being bogged down by these dead-end jobs. And, I mean, I don't have a problem with, like, a basic income or socialism if it's promoting something that is positive. I mean, I sort of like the idea. Maybe I'm looking out for my own self-interest as an artist, but I think I kind of like that idea of having funding for artists and writers.
Well, two things. One, I feel the same way about the National Endowment for the Arts, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the whole academic system. It is so corrupt and politically correct that I don't blame people for simply wanting to destroy it and salt the earth and start over fresh. But we cannot destroy civilization. We can't destroy arts and humanities. We need to support these things. And I do support the social credit idea of a basic minimum income. And the idea of phasing that in, starting with people with high IQs, I think is actually brilliant, because one of the worst possible outcomes of social credit is dysgenics. Because basically, you don't want to create a world full of, complacent, lazy Homer Simpsons, right? You don't want to do that. You want to create a world of creative, intelligent people. And if you phase it in with highly intelligent people and give that kind of leisure and security to the highly intelligent first, that will probably increase the number of highly intelligent people in the next generation. And maybe one of the ways that you can phase it in with lower IQ people is phase it in by securing a one child or less pledge on their part, which wouldn't be an unfair thing. to do. So you end up giving everybody a utopia, in a sense, where there's basic security, and yet at the same time, you don't have a dysgenic breeding trend baked into your utopia, which is really one of the problems with the welfare state today, no matter where it's practiced. Even in a homogeneous high IQ society, you're still probably going to see dysgenic breeding patterns if you put a welfare state in place.
We have to change the whole dichotomy about income inequality and the welfare state. Conservatives will just say anyone who receives a government subsidy is lazy and a parasite. We'll say that the rich deserve their wealth regardless, kind of this Calvinist mentality. I think the crucial problem in society is too much of the wealth is concentrated in the hands of a small parasitic elite, but the size of the underclass is becoming too big. So we kind of have to balance out those issues, think of ways to increase the numbers of intelligent people, but also reduce the wealth of the parasitic elites at the same time, and change the entire dichotomy between those two ways of thinking on the left and the right.
Yeah, I would agree. I toyed with this idea of income, upper income limits, except for artists and inventors. I kind of like the idea of having a society where the richest and most influential people are all people who got there because they actually create things, rather than people who simply manipulate money flows or repackage and resell things or whatever. I think that would be a wonderful kind of society, but that was just something I tossed out there as food for thought. I don't know if it's a completely workable proposal.
I mean, I like that ideal that, the artist should rule. I mean, certainly that in this economy of America that it looks like you always have to swindle somebody. You always have to do some strange jobs, from selling coat hangers to conning people about whatever, and then you become a millionaire off that if it's possible, unless somebody else is doing that. I think, if people were to do art, maybe I guess YouTube in some respect, that if you go and start a blog and do this, you certainly do get some fame, or at least in your network of friends, but it doesn't really make you any money, But I do like that ideal that, if only we had artists that were considered, I don't know, that culture seemed to go away now, and it seems like you're considered a bum if you're an artist, a writer, a musician, or, it doesn't seem like the government wants to spend that, yet that's like the center of all culture.
I've heard that in William Lewis's book, The Art of Being Ruled, he actually advocates the artist as being the ruling class as opposed to the commercial class.
I think that probably the best ruling class should be the warrior caste, based on sort of traditional models, but they have to be cultured. They have to be cultivated. And so the hidden legislators in any aristocratic society are going to be the people who form tastes and communicate ideas. So you would have philosophers and artists and educators, basically, would be sort of the hidden rulers shaping the people who actually rule. But the idea of the artist ruler is a very Nietzschean thing, and I certainly think it's better than being ruled by Philistines, whether they're military Philistines or commercial Philistines. That's a highly appealing image. Of course, Hitler was an artist ruler, wasn't he?
That's true.
Oh, what's funny is I've been seeing this kind of libertarian conservative meme going around saying Hitler was a whiny liberal arts student who was complaining about a privileged minority, complaining about basically comparing Hitler to SJWs. I mean, I don't like SJWs, and I'm not going to endorse Hitler, but at the same time, it just shows you the mentality of mainstream conservatives, libertarians, that they value people purely on how much money they have in their bank account rather than their creative potential.
There's a funny book. It's out by Feral House. It's called Hipster Hitler by James Carr, and it's basically what happens when you make Christian Lander's stuff white people like into a comic form, as if you view Adolf Hitler not because he was an evil man, but because he was an eccentric, pretentious white hipster you might find in any major metropolitan city, and it basically gives this lighthearted view that Hitler could be any stuff white people like person. But that meme reminds me of that or something.
But Hitler was, of course, one of the earliest anti-smoking advocates. That's what the Nazis in Germany were one of the first to advocate against smoking cigarettes.
Huh.
Well, but what I was going to say though is kind of what Robert was alluding to, is that the conservatives, at least in America, we've got these conservatives that whenever you get into debates with them, they always they view anyone's value as a person just by how much money they make, as if like I personally don't value money that much. It's just something that you need to get by, but they see everything clearly through this prism of how successful a business someone has. It like determines your worth. But, to me, like it really doesn't make, that much difference as like, that person who's making, like, they're not necessarily contributing to society. They don't necessarily have good aesthetic tastes. They're not like, there's so many different variables involved. And if as a country, if that's what you use to determine how great a person is or how great society is, how successful your society is just in GDP, well, that's what you have with America. Is you have this total, you've ended up with this total like a mess of this almost like just a clusterfuck of just a really ugly consumerist. If people are fat, and it's just a complete a mess. And you have these people that are saying, well, the GDP is going up. It doesn't matter that Los Angeles looks like like Mogadishu now or something. You know what I mean? Because the GDP is going up. The country's getting better. What are you talking about, dude? Yeah. Since we started the show off with, I think we should talk about the alt left and since we were on that program maybe about a year and a half ago, where it was then and where, where those sort of that sort of idea is now.
I think right now what I've seen that I've learned a lot, especially from Rabbit and Robert, but also from bloggers like Bay Area Guy and Prince of Queens and even Ryan from Stammesdat Publishing. It seems that the term alt-left is now flourishing. However, it's meaning multiple different things, from counter anti-social justice warrior to an alternative reforming of the whole left-wing spectrum, which I agree upon. That's more of Ryan's term. And then you have Rabbit, which is I like Rabbits too. It's more like this aesthetic and art type, but a left-wing faction of the alt-right. I think there's this huge confusion too with the mainstream media, where Greg Gutfield will go on a show and say, oh, the alt-left is everyone who's post-Occupy Wall Street, which is kind of nonsensical. And still, if you hashtag it, it doesn't, it has to be foundational alt-left, and it needs to be more writing. And I've tried making writing myself for it, and I think that there's some ideal about, this interest, like Greg said, about this European interest and this ideal of liberties and freedoms. Not exactly libertarianism, but certainly about having your freedoms and doing what you want, but having a good, healthy society at the same time.
On a previous show, Pilliter and I were kind of discussing what defines degenerate. And obviously, I think the problem is people who just dedicate their lives to following like trashy pop culture, or who drink too much just to kind of Oh, I mean, well, some people are lazy, but some people have issues or stressed out from work. But some people just have this kind of narrow, on the right, have this narrow idea of what is degenerate. If you like the wrong kind of art, or if you have certain preferences. And Pillager, do you want to kind of explain what we were talking about? It was that show we did about that Japanese film, that anime.
Oh yeah, the poem of the wind in the trees. That's one of my favorites. But the thing is, when people say degenerate, it's probably negative, and it means unhealthy, disgusting, grotesque, like modern art, like the whole piss Christ or the fat lady. That's just disgusting. It's bad. You don't want that in your system. However, sometimes there are things that are aesthetically pleasing and they're beautiful, but people will call them degenerate because it might be, gay or homosexual, but it's not that effective to the greater good cause, right? Like there are causes of, like on the alt-right, that if you do something that's, not orthodox, like you do something out of line of the orthodoxy, you might be called a degenerate for having. I mean, it's certainly shaming works, and shaming puts people into, back to healthy things. But it seems to me that this degenerate thing, it basically assumes that if you try to be more avant-garde about yourself, and if you're kind of this eccentric artist, and you might do this or that, people are going to call you degenerate for it. However, I think there are a lot of people that could be healthy for normative societies, and they could be saying that they want, healthy role models. I think that's where the left should be at. Like, the left is basically with open arms supporting both mass degeneracy and egalitarianism, which seems the most craziest thing ever. And that's giving them a bad rap about that. So if the left was to make like a good Christian-like person, where it's like a good, healthy, normative person, and have values which are left-wing, not self-destructive or generative, but like having a family, having friends, being supportive, then, you could, it's a good thing. It's the opposite of being degenerate. And going back on Robert said about the poem in the wind of the trees, that is aesthetically pleasing anime. However, it's basically a girls' show about two little boys, falling in love with each other. That, in by essence, degenerate as in, exactly, degenerate as in, well, it's sexually, but the thing is, it's aesthetically pleasing, and it's a very of a progress, but at the same time, you don't want the fallen. It's like, we talk about Lasse Nielsen, that film director,
Yeah, that's interesting, because Lasse Nielsen has this cult following among homosexual men, and there is a lot of controversy around him, but there's also this kind of theme of Nordicism and portraying a kind of utopian society. And I mean, I get the impression he's a leftist, but I just think he's just capturing the way like Denmark was in the 1970s.
Exactly.
Kind of that unique era where there was a sense of freedom, but it was before there was massive changes in Europe. So I just think he's kind of capturing that era in history. But with Katsuki no Uta, the aesthetic, it's a sort of Japanese interpretation of the European, like Art Nouveau and the traditional European aesthetic from the 18th century.
Oh yeah, there's just a lot of amazing animes. I mean, not only that, but if you look at Candy Candy, that was an old school Europe anime that was loving the whole European aesthetics, and other things too, futurism like Robotech and Captain Harlock. That's like a futurist utopian European society. It's a lot of those animes seem to envision this kind of strange fusion society of those things, and yeah.
One thing that I would say is that since over the events of like the past year or so, I actually identify a little bit closer to the alt-right now, because a lot of the factions and whatnot in that were part of the alt-right that I didn't get along with, a lot of them are less prominent now, and the ones that that I more closely associate with are, people like Richard Spencer, Greg Johnson. Those are a lot more amplified now. They've become more prominent. Spencer especially, and that was always the wing of the alt-right that I was the closest to. Because Spencer's like, he's an atheist, and has fairly like liberal worldview, which other people criticize him for. But I'm like, oh yeah, that's great. Like he does have a similar worldview to me. So that's what's been interesting. And then as the alt-left, as I originally envisioned it, as it's been invaded kind of by all of these other, oddballs and these other weird groups trying to use the term. Like I actually find myself closer to Spencer, and that's why I've gone out of my way to try to support a lot of those guys through when they're getting bombarded by the media and stuff. It would be very easy just to be like, yeah, I'm not with those guys. Like I'm totally different. I'm like, no. I totally stand with these guys, even though I have some ideological differences with Spencer and some of these other groups, like maybe some of the neo-imperialism, that sort of thing. And I still am supportive of those guys.
We are at the end of the show. I would like to thank Greg Johnson, Rabbit, and Pilliter for being on.
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed this.
Nice talking to you, Greg.
Yeah.